I'm Lieutenant Colonel Melissa Drew, 42 years old, and I've spent over 2 decades flying and coordinating missions that officially don't exist. For years, I trusted professionals to help me manage the aftermath of that work, the nightmares, the silence, the things I couldn't say. But when a therapist told me my combat memories were made up, I made a choice that changed everything. Have you ever been dismissed, doubted, or disrespected by someone who is supposed to help you? If so, tell me in the comments, because you're not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're tuning in from. And if you've ever had to stand your ground when someone questioned your truth, hit that like button and subscribe for more real stories about courage, boundaries, and reclaiming your voice. What happened next might surprise you. The office smelled like lavender and lies. Dr. Lucy Warren sat across from me, her notepad balanced on crossed legs, pen poised like she was about to diagnose something terminal. She was younger than I expected, early 30s, maybe, with the kind of smooth confidence that comes from never having your reality questioned by incoming fire. "Tell me about the nightmares again," she said, her voice soft and clinical. I'd been through this twice already. The intake form. The preliminary assessment. Now this, the third time explaining why I couldn't sleep more than 4 hours without waking up drenched in sweat, my hands reaching for controls that weren't there. "It's always the same," I said. "Red sand. Rotor blades. Static on the comms." She wrote something down. I watched her pen move across the page in smooth, deliberate strokes. "And these missions you describe," she continued, not looking up. "The ones in Kandahar. Can you walk me through one of them again?" There it was. That slight inflection. The professional skepticism wrapped in therapeutic concern. I know." She smiled, the kind that doesn't reach the eyes. "But I want to make sure I understand correctly. You were deployed as a pilot, is that right?" "Combat intelligence pilot," I said. "Reconnaissance and tactical coordination. And you flew how many missions?" "Classified." Her pen paused. "Of course. But roughly?" I kept my voice level. "Enough to know what jet fuel smells like when it's burning. Enough to know the difference between outgoing and incoming fire." She nodded slowly, still writing. I could see the doubt forming in the way she tilted her head, the way her mouth pressed into a thin line of professional concern. "Melissa," she said, setting down her pen. "Have you considered that maybe these memories feel so real because your mind is trying to protect you from something else?" The air in the room shifted. I'd heard variations of this before, from civilians who thought they understood, from well-meaning friends who'd never worn a uniform. But never from someone who was supposed to help me process what I'd actually lived through. "Protect me from what?" "Trauma takes many forms," she said carefully. "Sometimes our brains construct elaborate narratives to shield us from difficult truths. It's called a dissociative response." I sat perfectly still. Years of training had taught me how to control my breathing, how to keep my face neutral even when every instinct screamed to react. "You think I'm making it up." "Not making it up," she corrected quickly. "But perhaps constructing a version of events that feels more manageable than what actually happened." The session ended 20 minutes later with her asking if I'd be willing to try a new medication. Something to help with the intrusive thoughts. I told her I'd think about it, gathered my jacket, and walked out into the parking lot where the afternoon sun felt too bright, too ordinary. That night, I sat in my kitchen with a glass of water I didn't drink and stared at the dog tags hanging from my rearview mirror through the window. Captain Andrew Vale. Kia. Operation Silent Reach. The metal had worn smooth in places where I'd held them too many times, trying to remember his voice, his laugh, the way he'd call out coordinates with perfect precision even when the world was falling apart around us. Lucy Warren thought my mind was making it up. She thought I'd built some elaborate fantasy to cope with civilian anxiety, that the smell of burning fuel and the weight of a flight harness and the particular frequency of static that meant someone wasn't coming home. She thought all of that was just my brain playing tricks. I went to bed at 2200 hours and lay there until 0300, watching shadows move across the ceiling. When I finally slept, I dreamed of the valley. Flares lighting up the ridgeline. The crackle of radio traffic. Vale's voice cutting through the noise. "Nighthawk 6, you're clear for approach." But I wasn't clear. Nothing was clear. The ground lit up with tracer fire and something hit our tail rotor and suddenly we were spinning, the world tilting sideways, and I could hear Vale trying to stabilize while I fought the controls, and I woke up clutching the edge of my mattress, my shirt soaked through, my heart pounding like it was trying to escape my chest. The clock read 0400 hours. I got up, made coffee, and watched the sun rise over the parking lot. By 0600, I was dressed and ready for my shift at the base, moving through the motions of a normal morning because that's what you do. You compartmentalize. You function. You don't let them see you break. But Lucy Warren's words followed me through the day like smoke. Your mind's protecting you. As if protection meant erasure. As if the only way to survive was to pretend it never happened. I thought about canceling my next appointment. I thought about finding a different therapist, one who specialized in military trauma, who understood that classified didn't mean imaginary. But part of me, the part that had learned to push through every impossible situation, wanted to see where this would go. So when Thursday came around again, I drove back to that office with its lavender scent and its diplomas on the wall. I sat in the same chair and watched Lucy flip through her notes from our last session. I've been thinking about what you said, she began. About the classifications and the restricted information. I want to respect that, but I also need to understand what we're working with here. What we're working with, I said slowly, is 15 years of service. Multiple deployments. A career that left marks you can't see on an X-ray. I understand that you believe I don't believe anything, Dr. Warren. I know. There's a difference. She set down her notepad. Melissa, I'm not trying to invalidate your experience. But from a clinical perspective, when someone presents with symptoms that align with delusional attachment to a particular identity, delusional attachment. The words hung in the air between us like a challenge. I'm sorry, she said quickly. That came out wrong. What I mean is, sometimes people construct elaborate personal mythologies as a defense mechanism. It's not uncommon, especially in cases of severe anxiety or PTSD that stems from non-combat sources. Non-combat sources. I could have told her about Helmand Province. About the emergency exfiltration under fire that earned me my call sign. About the bronze star pinned to my dress uniform, the one I only wore for ceremonies because wearing your medals to therapy seemed like proving a point I shouldn't have to make. But I didn't. Because Nighthawk 6 was classified, and that classification existed for reasons that had nothing to do with whether my therapist believed me. Let's try something different, Lucy said, leaning forward. Tell me about your childhood. Before the military. What was that like? And just like that, she'd moved on. As if my entire adult life could be dismissed as a coping mechanism, as if the truth could be rescheduled for later discussion. I answered her questions about my mother, about growing up in a small town, about enlisting at 18 because I wanted something bigger than the life I'd been offered. I gave her the narrative she wanted, the young woman looking for purpose, for family, for belonging. What I didn't tell her was that I'd found all of that. And lost some of it too. In ways that no amount of talk therapy would ever fully address, because the words for what I'd experienced didn't exist in her vocabulary. The session ended with her suggesting we meet twice a week instead of once. I think we're making progress, she said, smiling that professional smile. I nodded and scheduled the appointments, already knowing I wouldn't keep them all. Because this wasn't progress. This was performing wellness for someone who'd already decided my truth was negotiable. I almost didn't show up for the next session. Stood in the parking lot for 10 minutes, keys in hand, watching other people walk into the building with their own complicated stories. A man in a business suit. A teenage girl with her mother. A couple holding hands like they were about to face something difficult together. I went inside because quitting felt like admitting something I wasn't ready to admit. Lucy was waiting with that same calm expression, the one that probably worked on most of her patients. She gestured to the chair and I sat, already counting down the 50 minutes until I could leave. How was your week? She asked. Fine. Any nightmares? Same as always. She made a note. I've been reviewing your file. The intake form mentioned insomnia, hypervigilance, and what you described as combat-related flashbacks. But there's something I need to clarify. Here it comes, I thought. Your service record, she continued carefully. The parts that aren't classified. They show administrative work, intelligence analysis, some flight training, but nothing that would typically result in combat exposure. I kept my breathing steady. That's because the missions that matter are the ones you can't see on a standard records request. I understand that's what you believe. It's not belief, Dr. Warren. It's clearance levels. She set down her pen and folded her hands in her lap, switching to what I recognized as her gentle confrontation mode. I'd seen it before with junior officers who thought they could psychology their way through command decisions. Melissa, I want to help you. But I can't do that if we're building our sessions on a foundation that might not be accurate. The word hung between us like an accusation dressed in therapeutic language. What exactly are you saying? I'm saying that sometimes trauma creates false memories. Vivid ones. Our brains are incredibly powerful. They can construct entire scenarios that feel completely real. It's a protective mechanism. I watched her face, looking for any hint that she understood how insulting this was. Found nothing but earnest concern. So you think I invented 15 years of military service? No, of course not. Your service is real. But the specific memories you're describing, the combat missions, the classified operations, I think your mind might be protecting you by giving you an identity that feels safer than whatever actually caused your PTSD. Safer, I repeated. Yes. The identity of a combat veteran, a decorated officer, someone who survived extraordinary circumstances, that's a powerful narrative. Much more manageable than, say, workplace trauma or assault or stop. She stopped. I stood up slowly, deliberately, the way I'd learned to move in high-stress situations when every gesture had to be controlled. You think I built this? Like I'm playing dress-up with someone else's trauma. That's not what you think the call sign is fake. The missions are fake. The people I lost are just characters in some story I told myself to feel important. Melissa, please sit down. Let's talk about this. I didn't sit. You wrote something in your notes last session. I saw it when you flipped the page. Possible delusional attachment to military identity. Want to know how I knew what it said from across the room? Because I was trained to read upside-down text during briefings. Because intelligence work means seeing what you're not supposed to see and remembering it perfectly. Her face flushed slightly. I shouldn't have. Those notes are supposed to be private. Everything's private until it matters, I said. Then it's evidence. And right now, you're building a case that I'm delusional instead of considering that maybe, just maybe, you're out of your depth. The silence that followed was different from the therapeutic pauses she'd been using. This one had weight. Consequence. I think we should continue this next week, she said quietly. When we've both had time to what? Reconsider reality? Figure out whose version of my life is more convenient. I picked up my jacket. She stood too, her professional composure cracking just enough to show something underneath, uncertainty, maybe, or the first whisper of doubt. I'm trying to help you, she said. No. You're trying to make me fit a diagnosis you understand. There's a difference. I left without scheduling another appointment. The receptionist called after me, but I kept walking, through the lobby, past the waiting room where other people sat with their manageable problems, out into the parking lot where the afternoon light felt harsh and exposing. That night, I pulled out my old footlocker from the back of my closet. Inside, flight logs I wasn't supposed to keep, photographs from deployments I couldn't talk about, the Bronze Star citation that used careful language to describe what happened in Helmand without actually describing anything classified. And the dog tags. Always the dog tags. Captain Andrew Vale had been my co-pilot for 3 years. We'd flown together so many times we could anticipate each other's moves, finish each other's checklists, communicate in the kind of shorthand that only comes from shared risk. He'd been the one to tell me about his daughter's first birthday, about his wife's promotion, about the house they were buying in Colorado. He'd been on my wing when we took fire over the valley. Had stayed on comms even when his bird was hit, had guided me through the evasion pattern while his own systems were failing, had made sure I got clear before. I sat on my bedroom floor holding those tags until my hands stopped shaking. The metal was warm from my grip, worn smooth in places where I'd held them too many times over the past 2 years. Lucy Warren thought this was delusion. Thought I'd constructed Andrew Vale, constructed the mission, constructed the moment when his voice cut out mid-transmission, and I knew, just knew, that he wasn't making it home. She thought I'd invented the sound of the crash. The radio silence that followed. The way Colonel Rains had looked at me during the debrief, his jaw tight with the kind of grief that comes from losing good people to bad situations. She thought I'd made up the funeral. The flag. The way Andrew's daughter had looked at me with 5-year-old eyes that didn't understand why Daddy wasn't coming home. I put the tags back in the footlocker. Put the footlocker back in the closet. Went to bed and didn't sleep. At 0200 hours, I made a decision. If Lucy Warren wanted proof, I'd give her proof. Not because I needed her validation. I'd spent too many years earning respect that mattered to care about one civilian therapist's opinion. But because maybe, somewhere in her clinical training and her diagnostic criteria and her careful notes about delusional attachment, there was a person who could learn what she didn't know. The next morning, I called her office and scheduled an appointment. The receptionist sounded relieved. Dr. Warren was hoping you'd call back, she said. She has an opening Thursday at 1400 hours. That works, I said. Thursday. 1400 hours. Enough time to make arrangements, to pull together what I needed, to decide exactly how this was going to unfold. Because Lucy Warren had made one critical mistake in her assessment. She'd assumed that because my truth was classified, it didn't exist. That secrecy meant fabrication. She was about to learn the difference between confidential and imaginary. And I was going to enjoy watching that lesson land. I enlisted at 18 with nothing but a high school diploma and a sharp score on the ASVAB. My recruiter had looked at my results and suggested intelligence work, said I had the kind of mind that could see patterns, connect dots that other people missed. I signed the papers and shipped out to basic training 3 weeks later. Started as an Airman Basic, E1, the lowest rung on a very long ladder. Spent my first year doing reconnaissance intel analysis, sitting in windowless rooms staring at satellite imagery until my eyes burned. Learning to read terrain, to identify threats, to translate raw data into actionable intelligence that kept people alive. I was good at it. Good enough that my supervisor recommended me for officer training school. Good enough that by 23, I'd earned my commission as a second lieutenant and started flight training. The Air Force needed people who could think and fly, who could process intelligence in real time while managing an aircraft under pressure. Turned out I could do both. By 26, I'd made Captain 03 and was flying reconnaissance missions that brought me close enough to combat zones to smell the smoke. Colonel Justin Rains noticed me during a deployment to Helmand Province. I was 29, newly promoted to major, when everything went sideways on what should have been a routine surveillance run. We'd been monitoring a convoy extraction when ground forces came under heavy fire. The medevac was pinned down, taking casualties, and command was scrambling to coordinate air support. I was closest, 15 minutes out with a full reconnaissance suite and enough fuel to stay on station. Rain's voice came through on the command channel. Nighthawk flight, we need eyes on that position now. I didn't hesitate. Pushed the throttle forward and dove into a hot zone that every safety protocol said to avoid. Andrew Vale was on my wing, Captain Vale back then, though we'd flown together enough that call signs mattered more than rank. Nighthawk 2, stay high, I told him. I'm going in low. Negative lead. You'll get shredded. That's why you're staying high. Someone needs to see where the fire's coming from. I dropped altitude until I could see muzzle flashes, until I could count the enemy positions and relay coordinates to the strike team. Took fire from 3 directions. Felt the aircraft shudder when rounds punched through non-critical systems. Kept my voice steady on the radio while alarms screamed in my headset. Ground team, Nighthawk 6. I have multiple positions marking now. The strike came in 30 seconds later. Fast movers rolling in with precision that only happened when the intel was exact. The enemy fire stopped. The convoy moved. The medevac lifted off with wounded who would have died without those extra minutes. I landed with 14 holes in my aircraft and hydraulic fluid leaking onto the tarmac. Rains met me on the flight line, his face unreadable in the way that senior officers get when they're deciding between a reprimand and a commendation. That was either the bravest or stupidest thing I've seen this month, he said. Yes, sir. He almost smiled. You just earned yourself a call sign. Nighthawk 6. For the officer who flies into the dark when everyone else has the sense to stay away. The call sign stuck. More importantly, the mission changed something in how command saw me. I wasn't just an intelligence officer who could fly. I was someone who could make the hard call when it mattered, who could operate in the space between reconnaissance and combat where most pilots never went. By 32, I'd made Lieutenant Colonel 05 and was leading a flight team on operations that didn't exist in any official record. The kind of missions where you filed a flight plan to one location and actually went somewhere else, where your after-action reports were classified above top secret, where the people you worked with understood that some truths stayed buried for reasons that transcended personal recognition. That's where Andrew Vale became more than a wingman. We flew together for 3 years on missions that required absolute trust. You don't survive that kind of work unless you know your co-pilot will cover your six even when the situation's falling apart, even when doctrine says to abort, even when the safest choice is to leave someone behind. We never left anyone behind. The Bronze Star came after a mission I still can't fully describe. What I can say, we extracted a high-value asset from a hostile zone under fire. What I can't say, who they were, where exactly we were, or how many other aircraft didn't make it out. The citation used phrases like exceptional valor and disregard for personal safety because those were the words that fit when the real story was locked in a vault somewhere. The Purple Heart came 6 months later. Different mission, same kind of situation, someone needed extraction. We went in, took fire, brought them home. Except this time the aircraft took critical damage, and we went down hard in territory that wasn't quite hostile, but wasn't friendly either. I remember the impact. The way the world tilted and everything loose became a projectile. The smell of fuel and hot metal and fear. Andrew's voice on the internal comms, steady even as we were spinning, calling out altitude and airspeed like we were practicing emergency procedures in a simulator. We walked away from that crash. Both of us. Bruised and bleeding but alive. The ground team reached us before anyone else did, and we flew out on a transport that pretended it had never been in that location. The injury that earned me the Purple Heart was a piece of shrapnel in my shoulder, small enough that it healed without major surgery, significant enough that it still aches when the weather changes. A permanent reminder that survival sometimes costs more than you expect. Colonel Rains pinned that medal on my uniform 6 weeks after the crash, in a ceremony that included exactly 8 people, all with clearances high enough to know what we'd actually done. He shook my hand and said something I've never forgotten. The real heroes are the ones who can't tell their stories. Remember that when the silence gets heavy. The silence did get heavy. Gets heavier every year. Because those 3 years flying with Andrew, those missions that tested everything we knew about aircraft and tactics and our own limits, none of that existed in any record Lucy Warren could access. We flew into places that weren't on maps, supported operations that never happened, brought home people whose names I'll never know. Did it over and over until it felt almost routine, until the impossible became just another item on the pre-flight checklist. Until Operation Silent Reach. Until the mission where Andrew's voice cut out mid-transmission and routine became catastrophic, and I learned that some silences never end. But Lucy Warren didn't know about that. Couldn't know, because it was classified. So when she looked at my service record, she saw an intelligence officer who'd done some flight work, earned some medals through circumstances she couldn't verify, and probably exaggerated the whole thing to make herself feel important. She saw the gaps in my file and filled them with doubt. With clinical explanations for why I might construct an elaborate fantasy. With therapeutic frameworks that made sense if you'd never worn the uniform, never taken the oath, never watched good people die for missions that officially never happened. I understood why she doubted. Civilians see the military through movies and news reports, through sanitized narratives that make sense in 30-second sound bites. They don't see the classified world, the operations that succeed precisely because nobody knows about them, the heroes who go home without parades because their heroism is stamped top secret. From her perspective, I was a woman with PTSD claiming an identity that couldn't be verified. A patient who needed help separating reality from trauma-induced fiction. From my perspective, she was proving exactly why some of us stopped talking about what we've done. Why we let civilians think we shuffled papers and flew training missions. Why we learn to smile and nod when someone thanks us for our service without understanding what that service actually entailed. Because the truth is classified. And classification doesn't just protect national security, it protects us from people like Lucy Warren, who mean well but can't comprehend what exists beyond their clearance level. I'd spent 15 years earning respect from people who mattered, commanders who trusted me with impossible missions, teammates who bet their lives on my judgment, enemies who learned to fear the call sign Nighthawk 6. I didn't need Lucy Warren's validation. But I was going to get it anyway. Because Thursday was coming, and I'd made arrangements, and she was about to learn what it meant when someone with my background decided to educate instead of explain. The lesson would be quick, professional, and absolutely unambiguous. Just like everything else I'd ever done in uniform. I spent the weekend trying to decide if I wanted to continue therapy at all. Sat on my apartment balcony with coffee that went cold while I watched traffic move through the intersection below. Normal people doing normal things. None of them carrying the weight of missions they couldn't discuss, losses they couldn't properly grieve. The question wasn't whether Lucy Warren was wrong. She was wrong, catastrophically, insultingly wrong. The question was whether fixing that misunderstanding was worth the energy it would cost. Part of me wanted to walk away. Find a therapist who specialized in military trauma, someone who understood that classified meant real, not imaginary. Someone who wouldn't look at my service records' redacted sections and conclude I was delusional. But another part, the part that had learned to push through every difficult situation, refused to let her dismissal stand unchallenged. Not because I needed her to believe me. Because she needed to learn what harm she was doing. How many other veterans had sat in that office and been told their combat experiences were constructed memories? How many had walked away from therapy entirely because the one person supposed to help them had instead questioned their reality? Monday morning, I reported to my duty station at the base and moved through the routines that still defined my days. Briefings. Reports. Coordination with teams whose missions I supported from the ground now instead of the air. My flight status was still active, but desk work had become the primary assignment after my last deployment cycle ended. The transition from operational flying to administrative work was supposed to be easier. Less stress. More regular hours. A chance to decompress from the years of high-stakes missions. Instead, it felt like being caged. Like having all the training and experience and hard-won skills, and being asked to file paperwork with them. The PTSD had started creeping in during that transition. When my hands weren't on the controls anymore, when my mind wasn't occupied with real-time threat assessment, all those memories I'd been compartmentalizing found their way forward. Night missions. Close calls. The faces of people I'd brought home and people I couldn't. Andrew's face most of all. That's what Lucy Warren didn't understand. The PTSD wasn't coming from some civilian trauma I was hiding behind a military identity. It was coming from the missions themselves, from the weight of responsibility and loss that accumulates when you spend years operating at the edge of what's possible. Tuesday, I ran into Colonel Rains in the hallway outside the operations center. He was older now, closer to retirement, with gray threading through his hair and the kind of tiredness that comes from decades of service. But his eyes were still sharp, still assessing. "Drew," he said, falling into step beside me. "Heard you're doing therapy off base." News traveled fast in military circles. "Yes, sir." "How's that going?" I considered lying. Considered saying it was fine. Everything was fine. I was processing things appropriately. But Rains had been my commanding officer during some of the worst missions I'd ever flown. He'd earned honesty. "The therapist thinks I'm delusional," I said. "Thinks I've constructed an elaborate fantasy about combat missions that never happened." He stopped walking. "You're joking." "No, sir." His jaw tightened in that way I remembered from bad briefings, from moments when reality wasn't matching expectations. "She said that to you directly?" "More or less. She's convinced my combat memories are a protective mechanism. That my mind invented Nighthawk 6 because the real trauma is something else." Rains was quiet for a moment, processing. "What are you going to do?" "I have an appointment Thursday." I'm going to clarify things. Need me to make a call? I can have her supervisor explain classification levels. No, sir. I've got it handled. He studied my face, looking for something. Whatever he found seemed to satisfy him. Good. Because that kind of incompetence is dangerous. Veterans stop seeking help when the help doesn't believe them. That's what I thought. You need anything, you call me. Don't care if I'm in a meeting with a general. This matters. Yes, sir. Thank you. He nodded and continued down the hallway, leaving me standing there with the confirmation that my instincts about Lucy Warren weren't just wounded pride. They were legitimate concern about someone practicing therapy without understanding her patient population. Wednesday night, I couldn't sleep. Lay in bed watching the ceiling fan rotate, thinking about what I was going to say, how I was going to handle it. The easy route was to simply show her my military ID with its clearance designations. The harder route was to let her really see what classification meant. I chose the harder route, because easy lessons don't stick. At 0200 hours, I gave up on sleep and made coffee. Pulled out my laptop and drafted an email to the base security office. Explained what I needed, why I needed it, what I planned to do with it. Got a response by 0400, approved, with conditions. By 0600, I had what I needed. A single sheet of paper, properly marked, properly authorized. Nothing classified on it, just the acknowledgement that classified information existed and that accessing it required clearance she didn't have. Thursday arrived with clear skies and temperatures that made me think of other clear days, other missions where weather was perfect and everything went wrong anyway. I dressed in civilian clothes but kept my military bearing, shoulders back, chin level, movements precise. Old habits. The drive to Lucy's office took 20 minutes through traffic that moved too slowly. I parked in the same spot as always, walked through the same lobby, signed the same check-in sheet. The receptionist smiled like nothing was wrong, like I was just another patient coming for just another session. Lucy met me at her office door, professional smile in place. Melissa. Come in. I sat in the familiar chair. She settled across from me with her notepad, pen ready. I wanted to start by apologizing, she said. Our last session got contentious, and I think I could have handled things better. You think I'm delusional, I said. That's not a communication problem. That's a judgment you've made about my mental state. She paused. I think we have different interpretations of your experiences. Different interpretations. I let that sit for a moment. Dr. Warren, do you know what a security clearance is? Of course. It's authorization to access classified information. And do you know what happens when someone without clearance tries to access information above their level? Her expression shifted slightly. Wariness creeping in. They're denied access. Correct. I reached into my jacket and pulled out the paper I'd prepared. Unfolded it slowly, deliberately. I'd like you to do something for me. I'd like you to verify my service record. I already have your service record on file. No. You have the unclassified summary. I'd like you to access my full record. Right now. She hesitated. I'm not sure you questioned whether my combat experiences were real. Said my mind might be constructing them. This is your chance to verify. One way or the other. I slid the paper across the space between us. It contained nothing classified, just my full name, rank, service number, and a note from the base security office confirming that my complete service record required TS/SCI clearance to access. Lucy picked up the paper, read it carefully. I don't have that level of clearance. I know. So I can't verify exactly, I said. You can't verify. Which means every conclusion you've drawn about my mental state has been based on incomplete information. You diagnose me with delusional attachment to a military identity without being able to see the actual identity you're claiming is delusional. The color was draining from her face. Professional composure starting to crack. I didn't mean to, you meant well, I said. I believe that. But meaning well isn't enough when you're treating populations you don't understand. You made assumptions based on what you could see, without considering what existed beyond your access level. She set down the paper with a hand that wasn't quite steady. What do you want me to do? I want you to verify my call sign. Right now. Use your computer. Search for Lieutenant Colonel Melissa Drew, United States Air Force. Melissa, do it. She turned to her computer slowly, like she was approaching something dangerous. Typed my name into what I assumed was some kind of personnel verification system. Waited while the search processed. Then her screen flashed red. The red on Lucy's screen was the specific shade that comes with security warnings. Not error red. Not warning red. The red that says you've just tried to access something you're not authorized to see. Text appeared. Access denied. Classified clearance required. Below that, in letters that seemed to pulse, call sign, Nighthawk 6. Lucy stared at the screen. I watched her face cycle through emotions, confusion, realization, horror. She pushed her chair back slightly, an unconscious movement away from information that suddenly had weight. "Oh my God," she whispered. I kept my voice level. Professional. The same tone I'd used on countless missions when staying calm meant survival. "I told you. I don't need validation from you or anyone else. I needed sleep. I needed help processing what I've actually lived through. Not therapy that questions whether I lived through it at all." She couldn't look away from the screen. "I didn't know. That's the point. You didn't know because you couldn't know. My service record is classified for reasons that have nothing to do with whether you believe me. But you made clinical decisions based on what you could see, and concluded that what you couldn't see must not exist. I'm so sorry." Sorry doesn't fix the diagnosis you were building. Delusional attachment to military identity. Do you know what that would have done if it ended up in my official medical file? The career damage? The security clearance review? Her hands were shaking now. I would never have. I was just taking notes, trying to understand. You were building a case that I was mentally unfit, based on incomplete information and assumptions about what classified means. The screen timed out, returning to her desktop. But the damage was done. The truth had landed exactly as I'd intended. She turned back to me, and for the first time since we'd started therapy, I saw her as something other than the confident professional who had all the answers. She looked young, uncertain, completely out of her depth. "What do I do now?" she asked. Good question. One I'd thought about extensively over the past few days. "You learn," I said. "You figure out what you don't know about military trauma, about classified operations, about the kind of PTSD that comes from missions you can't discuss. You educate yourself so the next veteran who walks through your door doesn't get dismissed because their truth is inconvenient." "I will. I promise I will." "And you revise your notes on my case. Remove any reference to delusional thinking. Because that's not diagnosis, that's malpractice." She nodded quickly, already reaching for her notepad. "Of course. Right away." I stood. The session wasn't over. We had 25 minutes left. But I was done. "Where are you going?" she asked. "Home. I'll find another therapist. Someone who specializes in what I actually need. Please don't. Let me fix this. Let me help you properly." I paused at the door. Part of me wanted to walk away, to never look back, to find someone competent from the start. But another part, the part that had spent years training junior officers, mentoring younger pilots, trying to make the military better from inside, saw an opportunity. "You really want to help?" "Yes. Absolutely." "Then start by admitting you're not qualified for this case." "Not yet. You need additional training before you can effectively treat combat veterans with classified service records." The words clearly hurt. But she didn't argue. "You're right. Contact the VA. They have programs for civilian therapists who want to work with military populations. Take them. All of them. Learn what classified means in practical terms, not just theoretical ones." "I will. And in the meantime, we can continue sessions. But on different terms. No more speculation about whether my experiences are real. No more clinical frameworks that assume trauma has to be verifiable to be valid. You treat what I tell you as fact, and we work from there." She was quiet for a long moment, processing. "Then, those terms are acceptable. More than acceptable. They're what I should have been doing from the start." I sat back down. The rest of the session was different. Lucy asked about coping strategies, about what helped when the nightmares came, about practical tools for managing hypervigilance. She didn't ask about missions or details or anything that required me to violate classification. She treated me like someone who knew what they'd experienced and needed help processing it, not someone who needed to prove their reality first. It was what therapy should have been from the beginning. When the 50 minutes ended, she walked me to the door. "Thank you," she said quietly, "for not just walking away, for giving me the chance to do better. Don't thank me yet. This only works if you follow through on the training." "I will. You have my word." I left feeling something I hadn't felt after our previous sessions, cautious hope. Not because Lucy Warren had suddenly become an expert in military trauma, but because she'd been willing to admit she wasn't, and that admission was the first step toward competence. The drive home took me past the base. I pulled into the visitors' lot and sat there for a while, watching aircraft take off in the distance. F-16s running training exercises, their engines leaving contrails against the clear sky. I'd flown birds like that. Different models, different missions, but the same fundamental truth. You trusted the aircraft to do its job, and it trusted you to do yours. When that mutual trust broke down, people died. Therapy was supposed to work the same way. I trusted the therapist to help me process trauma, and they trusted me to be honest about what I'd experienced. Lucy had broken that trust by questioning whether my experiences existed at all. But trust could be rebuilt. Slowly. With effort from both sides. My phone buzzed. Text from Colonel Rains. "How'd it go?" I typed back, "She learned." His response came immediately, "Good. You need anything, I'm here." I sat there for another 10 minutes, watching the aircraft, thinking about Andrew and all the others who hadn't made it home. Thinking about how Lucy's initial response, the doubt, the dismissal, was probably what drove some veterans away from therapy entirely. How many were out there struggling alone because someone had told them their trauma was imaginary? Too many. Always too many. That's what made this matter. Not my pride. Not proving I was right. But the possibility that one therapist learning to do better might help other veterans down the line. That Lucy Warren might become the kind of professional who made therapy feel safe instead of adversarial. I started the car and drove home. Fixed dinner that I barely tasted. Tried to sleep and managed 4 hours before the nightmares came. But this time, when I woke up at 0300 with my heart racing and Andrew's voice still echoing in my head, I knew I could call Lucy Warren in the morning and tell her I was struggling. And she wouldn't question whether the struggle was real. She'd just help me manage it. That was progress. Small, but real. The kind that accumulated over time if you worked at it. The kind that maybe would eventually feel like healing. Lucy Warren kept her word. 3 days after our confrontation, I received an email confirming she'd enrolled in a VA-sponsored training program for civilian therapists treating military personnel. The program was intensive, 8 weeks of coursework covering everything from combat-related PTSD to the unique challenges of classified service records. Our next session felt different from the start. She'd rearranged her office slightly, moved a few things around. Small changes, but I noticed. Years of intelligence work made you notice everything. I wanted to apologize again, she said once we'd settled in. Properly this time. What I did wasn't just unprofessional. It was harmful. You came here for help and I made things worse by questioning your reality. I nodded. Not accepting yet, just acknowledging. I've been reading, she continued. About military culture, about classification systems, about how trauma presents differently in combat veterans versus civilian populations. I should have done this research before I ever took you on as a patient. Why didn't you? She was quiet for a moment. Honestly, I thought I knew enough. I'd treated a few veterans before, mostly reservists, some National Guard. Nobody with extensive combat experience. Nobody with a classified service record. I assumed the principles were the same. They're not. No, they're really not. She paused, choosing her words carefully. The reading materials talk about how classification creates a unique burden. You carry trauma you can't fully explain, losses you can't properly grieve, experiences you can't share even with people who want to support you. That's accurate. And I added to that burden by making you prove something you shouldn't have had to prove. I'm sorry. The apology felt genuine this time. Not just professional courtesy, but actual remorse. I'm willing to continue sessions, I said. But we need to establish boundaries. There are things I can't tell you. Not because I don't want to, but because I legally can't. You have to be okay with gaps in the narrative. I understand. The training materials were clear about that. I'm supposed to work with what you can share, not push for details that could compromise security or put you in legal jeopardy. Good. She pulled out a new notepad, fresh pages, no previous notes contaminating what came next. I'd like to start over. Treat this as an intake session. Tell me what you need from therapy in your own words. I thought about it. Really thought about it. What did I need? I need help sleeping, I said finally. The nightmares come every night. Sometimes multiple times. I wake up exhausted. Tell me about the nightmares. Not the specific missions, just the general themes. Fire. Radio chatter. The moment when something goes wrong and you know someone's not coming home. I kept my voice steady. I see faces. Hear voices. Experience things that already happened like they're still happening. She made notes. Different notes than before, focused on symptoms, not skepticism. What coping strategies have you tried? Running helps. Physical exhaustion makes it harder for my brain to stay active at night. I've tried meditation apps, white noise, melatonin. Nothing really works. What about during the day? Do you experience flashbacks? Sometimes. Loud noises. Helicopters overhead. The smell of jet fuel. Things that wouldn't bother most people but take me right back. She nodded. That's called sensory triggering. It's common with PTSD. We can work on grounding techniques, ways to stay present when those triggers hit. The session continued in that vein. Practical strategies. Evidence-based approaches. No speculation, no armchair psychology, no attempts to diagnose the source of my trauma. Just acknowledgement that the trauma existed and tools for managing it. It was exactly what I needed from the start. Over the following weeks, we fell into a rhythm. Twice-weekly sessions focused on sleep hygiene, anxiety management, techniques for handling intrusive memories. Lucy studied her training materials between our appointments and came prepared with approaches specifically designed for combat veterans. She learned to recognize when I was shutting down, when the professional composure I maintained was actually dissociation disguised as control. She learned that sometimes silence wasn't resistance, it was processing. That veterans who'd spent years in high-stress situations didn't always respond well to gentle probing, but respected direct questions and clear boundaries. Most importantly, she learned to trust that I knew what I'd experienced, even if she'd never understand the full scope of it. 6 weeks into our renewed therapy relationship, I had my first full night's sleep in 3 years. 8 uninterrupted hours. I woke up confused, disoriented by the sunlight streaming through my window at 0800 hours. I texted Lucy, slept through the night. First time since I can remember. Her response came quickly. That's significant progress. Same time Thursday. Yeah. At that session, we talked about what had changed. The combination of cognitive behavioral therapy techniques, better sleep routines, and the simple fact that I finally felt safe in therapy. That I didn't have to defend my reality before working on healing from it. I've been thinking, Lucy said toward the end of the hour. Would you be willing to share your experience, not the classified details, but the general process, with my supervisor? We're trying to develop better protocols for treating veterans with classified service records. I considered it. The idea of reliving that initial confrontation, even in broad terms, wasn't appealing. But if it helped other veterans avoid the same experience, what would that involve? A meeting with Dr. Alan Kearns, the senior psychologist who oversees my practice. He's developing training materials for our entire group. Your insights could help shape how we approach similar cases in the future. Would I have to disclose anything classified? Absolutely not. Just the therapeutic experience itself. What went wrong? What went right after we corrected course? I'll think about it. She didn't push. That was another thing she'd learned, when to advance and when to hold position. I left that session feeling something unexpected, gratitude. Not because Lucy Warren had fixed everything, PTSD didn't work that way, but because she'd been willing to acknowledge her mistakes, to learn, to become the kind of therapist who actually helped instead of harmed. That weekend, I met with Colonel Rains for coffee at a place off base. He'd been checking in regularly since learning about my therapy situation, making sure I was getting proper support. "You look better," he said, settling into the booth across from me. "Sleeping better. That'll do it." He stirred his coffee slowly. "I heard your therapist enrolled in specialized training. News travels fast. Always does. Especially when it's good news." He took a sip. "You did something important there, Drew. You could have just filed a complaint and walked away. Instead, you educated someone who needed educating." "I almost did walk away. But you didn't. That takes patience most people don't have. Especially when someone's questioning your entire professional identity." He paused. "How's she doing?" "The therapist?" "Better. Much better. She's actually helping now." "Good." He set down his cup. "Because there are a lot of people like you out there. People with classified service records who need therapy but can't fully explain what they're processing. If she can learn to treat them properly, that matters." I nodded. It did matter. More than my individual experience. More than one therapist's initial incompetence. "Her supervisor wants to meet with me," I said. "Develop protocols for other cases." "You going to do it?" "Probably. If it helps." Rains smiled slightly. "There's the officer I know. Always thinking about the bigger mission." We talked for another hour about other things: his pending retirement, my potential reassignment to the Pentagon, the state of current operations. Normal conversation between two people who'd seen too much but kept serving anyway. When we parted in the parking lot, he shook my hand firmly. "Keep flying, Nighthawk 6. Even when you're grounded." "Yes, sir." I drove home thinking about that phrase. Keep flying. It meant different things depending on context. Keep working. Keep pushing. Keep living when everything in you wanted to shut down. I'd been flying for 15 years, literally and figuratively. Through missions that tested every limit, through losses that carved pieces out of my soul, through a career that demanded everything and acknowledged almost nothing. And I'd keep flying. Because that's what we did. We adapted. We overcame. We found ways to function even when functioning seemed impossible. Lucy Warren had been an obstacle, a significant one, but obstacles were just problems requiring solutions. I'd found the solution. We'd corrected course. Now we were flying steady. 2 months after Lucy Warren's screen had flashed red with my call sign, she requested a final session before my reassignment to the Pentagon. I'd received orders 3 weeks earlier, a staff position coordinating intelligence operations, the kind of job that used my experience without requiring active flight status. It felt like an ending, not just of therapy, but of a chapter. 15 years in operational roles, and now a transition to strategic planning. The kind of career progression that made sense on paper, but felt like losing part of my identity. Lucy had helped me process that transition. Helped me understand that change didn't mean loss, that new roles could still carry meaning even if they didn't involve flying into dangerous situations. She'd gotten better at this work, remarkably better, in the short time we'd been working together properly. I arrived at her office on a Thursday afternoon, 1400 hours, same time slot I'd occupied for months. The receptionist smiled as I signed in. I'd become familiar furniture here, another regular in the rotation of people seeking help. Lucy met me at her door. "Melissa, come in." We settled into our usual positions, me in the chair that faced the window, her on the small couch with her notepad. The notepad was mostly for show now. She'd learned that I responded better to conversation than clinical observation. "How are you feeling about the move?" she asked. "Conflicted. It's a good opportunity. Better work-life balance. No more deployment cycles. But it feels like being put out to pasture. You're 42. Hardly retirement age. In operational terms, I'm ancient. Most combat pilots transition to desk work by their mid-30s. I held on longer than most." She made a note, not a clinical observation, just a reminder. "What does holding on longer than most cost you?" Good question. One I'd been avoiding. "Everything," I said finally. "Relationships. Sleep. Peace of mind. The ability to hear a helicopter without flinching. But I was good at it. Really good. I saved lives. Completed missions that mattered. Made a difference in ways that most people will never know about. And now you're worried that difference-making is over." Something like that. Lucy set down her notepad entirely. Can I share something I've learned over the past few months? From working with you, but also from the training. Go ahead. The military teaches you to measure value in missions completed, lives saved, objectives achieved. Very concrete metrics. But the impact you have doesn't end when you stop flying. It just changes form. I waited for her to continue. You changed me, she said. Fundamentally changed how I approach this work. Because of you, I'm better equipped to help other veterans. Because of you, Dr. Kearns is developing protocols that will influence how dozens of therapists treat military patients. That's impact. It just doesn't come with a medal. It's not the same. No, it's different. But different doesn't mean lesser. We sat with that for a moment. Outside the window, I could see traffic moving through the intersection. Normal people living normal lives, completely unaware that someone was sitting 50 feet away processing the weight of a career spent in classified shadows. I met with Dr. Kearns last week, I said. Talked about my experience here. He recorded it, not my name, not identifying details, just the therapeutic journey. How did that feel? Strange. Exposing. But useful, I think. He asked good questions. Really listened to what went wrong and why. He told me about the session. Said you were generous with your feedback. I was honest. Told him the initial diagnosis almost ended my career. Told him how classification creates barriers that civilian therapists don't understand. Told him that meaning well isn't enough. You need specific training for military populations. Lucy nodded slowly. He's implementing some of your suggestions. Mandatory training for any therapist who wants to treat active duty or veteran patients. Consultation requirements for cases involving classified service records. Better oversight of diagnostic decisions. Good. It won't fix everything. But it's a start. The session continued in that vein: reflection on progress, discussion of ongoing challenges, planning for continuity of care after my move to DC. Lucy had already provided referrals to 3 therapists near the Pentagon who specialized in military trauma. All 3 had the proper training. All 3 understood what classified meant. With 20 minutes left, Lucy asked a question she'd never asked before. Do you forgive me? I looked at her, really looked at her. Saw someone who'd made a significant mistake and done the hard work of correcting it. Someone who'd been humble enough to admit what she didn't know and committed enough to learn it. Yes, I said. I forgive you. Her eyes got shiny. Professional composure slipping for just a moment. Thank you. That means more than you know. You earned it. You could have gotten defensive, could have doubled down on your initial assessment. Instead, you learned. That takes courage. I'm not sure courage is the right word. More like terror that I'd damaged someone who'd already been through enough. That works too. We both smiled, real smiles, not therapeutic masks. What are you going to do when you get to DC? She asked. Find an apartment. Report to my new assignment. Try to figure out who I am when I'm not flying anymore. You'll figure it out. You're good at adapting. How do you know? Because you adapted to working with a therapist who initially thought you were delusional. If you can make that work, you can handle anything. Fair point. The last 10 minutes, we talked about practical things. Medication management. I'd been on a low-dose sleep aid that was helping, needed to find a prescriber in Virginia. Emergency protocols if the PTSD spiked during the transition. Contact information for crisis resources. Then our time was up. Lucy walked me to the door, something she didn't usually do. We stood there awkwardly for a moment, 2 professionals who'd started as adversaries and ended as something close to allies. Thank you, she said quietly. For your patience. For teaching me what I needed to know. For not giving up on therapy entirely after I failed you so badly. You didn't fail. You stumbled. Then you got back up and did better. I hope your next therapist appreciates what they're getting. A patient who's honest, insightful, and willing to do the work even when it's difficult. I hope I find one half as good as you became. We shook hands. Professional. Respectful. A proper ending to a relationship that had nearly ended before it started. I walked through the lobby one last time, past the waiting room where I'd spent so many hours anticipating sessions that ranged from confrontational to constructive. Stepped outside into afternoon sunshine that felt too bright, too normal. My phone buzzed before I reached my car. Text from an unknown number. Nighthawk 6, cleared for takeoff. Keep flying. I stared at the message. Looked back at the building. Lucy Warren stood in the window of her second-floor office, phone in hand, watching me leave. I typed back, "Roger that. Thanks for the tower guidance." Her response came immediately, "Anytime. Safe travels." I got in my car and sat there for a moment, processing. The entire therapeutic relationship had been contained in this parking lot, this building, these sessions over the past few months. And now it was over. But the impact would continue. The protocols Dr. Kearns was implementing. The training Lucy had completed. The other veterans who would walk into that office and get proper care from the start, because I'd been willing to educate instead of just walking away. That was impact. Just a different kind than I was used to. I drove back to base, thinking about what Lucy had said. About value and metrics and how difference-making changes form when your role changes. About how the mission continues even when your position in it shifts. Maybe she was right. Maybe the Pentagon job wasn't being put out to pasture. Maybe it was just a different kind of flying, strategic instead of tactical, long-term instead of immediate, shaping policy instead of executing missions. The work still mattered. I just had to learn to measure it differently. That night, I slept 6 hours without waking. Not perfect, but progress. The nightmares still came sometimes, but less frequently, less intensely. The coping strategies Lucy had taught me actually helped. 3 weeks later, I loaded my belongings into a moving truck and drove east toward Virginia. Toward the Pentagon. Toward a new chapter in a career that had already exceeded every expectation I'd had at 18 when I first signed those enlistment papers. My phone buzzed somewhere in Maryland. Another text from Lucy Warren. Just finished my first session with a Navy SEAL. Classified service record. I knew exactly how to handle it. Thank you for preparing me. I smiled and typed back, "You would have figured it out eventually." Her response, "Maybe. But I'm glad I didn't have to figure it out on his time. You gave me the tools to help him from day one." That was worth something. Worth the confrontation, the education, the effort of rebuilding trust. Worth everything, really. I kept driving east toward whatever came next. The Pentagon was exactly what I expected, massive, bureaucratic, filled with people who'd traded operational roles for strategic influence. My new office was small but functional, with a window that overlooked a parking lot instead of a flight line. The view felt symbolic. My first week involved mostly administrative tasks. In processing. Security briefings. Meetings with people whose names I'd forget by the end of the day. The kind of work that made me understand why some officers retired rather than transitioned to staff positions. But there were moments, briefings where my operational experience provided context others missed, planning sessions where I could influence decisions that would affect missions I'd never fly, that reminded me why this job mattered. Lieutenant Colonel Melissa Drew, Strategic Intelligence Coordinator. It sounded impressive on paper. Felt like a cage most days. I found an apartment in Arlington, close enough to work that I could walk when the weather cooperated. Found a new therapist too, Dr. Sarah Chin, mid-40s, former Army psychologist who understood military culture from the inside. Our first session felt easy in a way that made me appreciate how hard Lucy Warren had worked to reach confidence. "I reviewed the notes from your previous therapist," Dr. Chin said. She sent a comprehensive transfer summary. Very thorough. She learned a lot. I noticed. The early notes are concerning, speculation about delusional thinking, questioning the validity of your service record. But the later notes show significant growth in her approach. She made mistakes. Then she fixed them. Dr. Chin nodded. That's all we can ask. Therapists are human too. We get things wrong sometimes. The measure of competence is what we do after recognizing the error. We talked through my transition, the challenges of the new role, the ongoing management of PTSD symptoms. She recommended continuing the sleep medication, adding some cognitive behavioral therapy techniques specific to career transitions. Everything evidence-based, practical, respectful of what I'd experienced without needing to know details I couldn't share. It was what therapy should be. What it had taken Lucy Warren months to learn. 6 weeks into the Pentagon assignment, I received an email from Dr. Alan Kearns. Subject line: Protocol Implementation Update. The message detailed how my feedback had shaped new policies at Lucy's practice group. Mandatory military cultural competency training for all therapists. Consultation requirements for any case involving active duty service members or veterans. Specific protocols for handling classified service records, including language about what therapists could and couldn't ask. At the bottom, your willingness to share your experience has already impacted care for 23 veterans in our practice. Thank you for turning a negative experience into positive change. 23 veterans. 23 people who wouldn't have to prove their reality before getting help. 23 therapeutic relationships that would start from a foundation of trust instead of skepticism. That was impact. I forwarded the email to Colonel Rains with a note. Apparently, I'm still making a difference. Just looks different than it used to. His response came within minutes. Leadership always looks different from the outside than it feels from the inside. You're doing exactly what a lieutenant colonel should be doing, influencing systems, not just executing missions. Proud of you, Nighthawk. I read that message 3 times. Let it sink in. Rains didn't offer praise lightly. If he thought I was making a difference, maybe I was. 3 months into the Pentagon job, I attended a briefing on tactical air operations in the Middle East. The colonel running the briefing was proposing changes to reconnaissance protocols that would have gotten people killed. I could see it clearly: the gaps in coverage, the vulnerability windows, the assumptions about response times that didn't account for real-world conditions. I raised my hand. Yes, Colonel Drew? The proposed coverage pattern creates a 17-minute gap in Sector 3. That's enough time for significant enemy movement without detection. The briefing officer looked at his slides. The models show adequate coverage. The models are wrong. I flew that sector for 3 years. There's a ridgeline that blocks line-of-sight sensors. You need overlapping coverage from multiple angles or you're flying blind. Silence in the room. Then a brigadier general at the head of the table. Colonel Drew is correct. I've seen that gap exploited before. Revise the protocols to address her concern. The briefing officer nodded, making notes. Yes, sir. After the meeting, the general stopped me in the hallway. You're Nighthawk 6. Not a question. A statement. Yes, sir. I've read your file. The parts I'm cleared for anyway. He smiled slightly. We need more people like you in these planning roles. People who've actually done the work, who can spot the gaps between theory and practice. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me. Just keep catching mistakes before they kill people. I walked back to my office thinking about that exchange. About how leadership could mean flying into hostile territory, or it could mean sitting in briefing rooms catching fatal errors before they became operational plans. Different forms, same core purpose: keeping people alive. That night, I slept 7 hours. Woke up once from a nightmare but used Dr. Chen's grounding techniques and fell back asleep within 20 minutes. Progress. For months in, I received a letter. Actual physical mail, forwarded from my previous duty station. The return address was Lucy Warren's practice. Inside, a handwritten note. Melissa, I wanted you to know that I've started teaching. Dr. Kearns asked me to develop a workshop on military cultural competency for other civilian therapists. I told him I wasn't qualified. He reminded me that I learned from the best teacher possible, someone who'd lived the experience I was trying to understand. The workshop is based on what you taught me. About classification, about trust, about the harm we do when we question people's reality instead of helping them process it. 37 therapists have completed the training so far. They're all better prepared than I was when we met. Thank you for being patient enough to educate me. Thank you for not giving up. And thank you for your service, not just to the country, but to all the veterans who will benefit from the lessons you taught me. Lucy, I put the letter on my desk where I could see it. Physical proof that difficult conversations could lead to meaningful change. That mistakes could become lessons if people were willing to learn. 6 months into the Pentagon assignment, Colonel Rains retired. I attended the ceremony at Andrews Air Force Base, watching a man who'd served 33 years receive the honors he'd earned. He'd given me my call sign, had trusted me with impossible missions. Had checked in regularly when I was struggling with therapy, making sure I got proper support. At the reception afterward, he found me near the buffet. Drew, glad you could make it. Wouldn't miss it, sir. Stop calling me sir. I'm retired. Call me Justin. It felt wrong, but I tried. Congratulations, Justin. He smiled. That's going to take some getting used to for both of us. He paused. I heard about the briefing. The coverage gap you caught. News travels fast. Always does. Especially when someone prevents a preventable disaster. He looked at me seriously. You're doing important work, Melissa. I know it doesn't feel like flying, but you're influencing missions across multiple theaters. That's strategic impact. I'm learning to see it that way. Good. Because the Air Force needs people like you in these positions. People who've been there, who know what works and what gets people killed. He raised his glass of champagne. To new missions. I raised mine. To new missions. We talked for another hour about his retirement plans, my adjustment to the Pentagon, the state of current operations. Normal conversation, except it was the last time we'd have it with him in uniform. When I left the reception, I drove past the flight line. Watched aircraft taking off into dusk, their lights blinking against darkening sky. Felt the familiar ache, the longing to be up there, hands on the controls, doing the work I'd trained for. But I also felt something else. Satisfaction that I'd caught that coverage gap. That I'd influenced protocols that would keep pilots safer. That somewhere, people I'd never meet were flying missions that worked better because I'd been in that briefing room. Different impact. Same purpose. 8 months in, I received an email from Lucy Warren. Subject, you need to see this. Attached was a letter from a Navy SEAL she'd been treating. He'd written to thank her for being the first therapist who understood his experience without question, who treated his classified service record as fact rather than fantasy, who helped him process trauma without making him prove it first. Lucy's note at the bottom, this is because of you. Every veteran I help properly is because you taught me how. Thank you. I saved that email. Added it to a folder of things that mattered, commendations, citations, letters from teammates, photographs from deployments. Proof that the mission continued, even when you weren't flying. That's how you're imagining it turned into a hard boundary and better care for more veterans. If this resonated, like, subscribe, and share it with someone who needs backup today. Has a professional ever dismissed your lived experience? What did you do next? If you've dealt with PTSD or trauma, what actually helped? No details that break your privacy needed. What's your one-line boundary when someone questions your reality? If you were me in that office, what would you have said? Drop where you're watching from and hit the bell so you don't miss the next story about standing your ground.